Welcome to This Week in Surgery Centers. If you're in the ASC industry, then you're in the right place. Every week, we'll start the episode off by sharing an interesting conversation we had with our featured guest, and then we'll close the episode by recapping the latest news impacting surgery centers. We're excited to share with you what we have, so let's get started and see what the industry's been up to. Hi, everyone. Here's what you can expect on today's episode. Scott Allen is the SVP of Managed Care at Nimble, and he's on today's show to help us wrap up our Payor Contract series. We have already covered 6 tips for effective contract management and how to leverage data for negotiations in this series, and we'll finish up by doing a deep dive into Chargemaster Essentials today. Scott walks us through common issues, making sure your Chargemaster is up to date, and how to maintain it effectively. In our news recap, we'll cover a kickback lawsuit in New York, potential AI bias, the role of automation in RCM, and of course, end the news segment with a positive story about a nurse who saved a patient's life who was having a stroke. Before we get to our guest discussion, though, I wanted to remind you all again that we are currently offering a $50 gift card to any listener who takes a few minutes out of their day to complete our podcast survey. We would love to hear from you on what you find most valuable, what we could improve on, the segments you like best, what you would like to see us add, and anything else you'd like to share. We are capping it at the first 30 responses, though. So if you want that $50 gift card, make sure you move fast and head to the link in the episode notes to get started. And thank you in advance to everyone who takes a few minutes to complete it and to everyone who already has. I really appreciate it. And with that, hope everyone enjoys the episode. And here's what's going on this week in surgery centers.
Scott, welcome to the show.
Welcome. Thank you.
Can you give our listeners a quick overview of your role and area of expertise at Nimble?
Absolutely. Yeah. Scott Allen, SVP of Managed Care at Nimble. I've been here for 17 years. I handle all aspects of managed care contracting, negotiations, internal strategy, anything you can think of with payers, I handle.
Great. So I think today within this realm of payers and managed care contracting, we wanted to dive in and talk specifically about the Chargemaster. So as a level set for our listeners, can you just give a basic overview of, hey, what is a Chargemaster and why is it important?
Yeah, absolutely. I think today I was interested in this topic. Chargemaster is something that, we hear a lot about. I think a lot of ASCs, as you know, they have to deal with it day to day. It's a patient-facing aspect as well, too. So very important. But I still see it just a lot of variation on how ASCs set their Chargemaster, how they understand their Chargemaster, and then tying into managed care contracting, why is it important to my managed care contract? So I think, today on this podcast, hoping just to kind of get some information to the group to they can take back to their ASCs today and really apply to hopefully make some change.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So for some of our listeners that may not be as familiar, what is this Chargemaster that we hear about?
Yeah, great question. So Chargemaster is essentially what is hard loaded in the software system set to be billed to that payer. So for example, you may have a code in the system, that code set to bill $3,000 full bill charge. That is the gross charge going to the payer. And so we say Chargemaster essentially is the grouping of all of your codes that you may bill frequently tied in with your revenue codes and then anything that may apply to how that is billed out to that particular payer.
Great. So essentially we can kind of think of this as, any service that the ASC would provide or charge for is going to be, loaded there in that Chargemaster, right?
Yeah, and it's a little bit more complex too. So you have, surgical codes, so codes that represent surgical cases and surgery, and you have implant codes, drugs, all types of different codes that are loaded in there that may have different revenue codes, but also different ways to think about how you would charge for those. So for example, as you probably know, implantable devices have more of a soft charge, right? You may have, one HCPCS code representing multiple types of implant sizes, shapes, or forms. So, that code has to be set in the system so it recognizes, this particular implant is this cost and this is the bill charge going out. And then on the managed care side, you have to make sure you understand how that payer is going to interact with. And just listening to some of your podcasts, sounds like your audience is well aware of, those contract allowed amounts and how the payer is going to handle them. But that charge amount is very important In some cases, if you have a cost plus, you may have situations where that payer is regulating the exact charge going out to that claim. So you may, they may say you have to bill 2 times, or you have to bill invoice cost to regulate what that billed charge is going out. And, just a little story here, working in this industry for so long, we encountered, a client that needed help and, getting in there, finding out that they had some charge master issues. And this relates to not only the updating the charge master, but how you notify the payer as well. But they had contracts that were tied to a percentage of bill charge, meaning, they had language in there, unlisted codes, direct language that's tied to what you bill and what you're paid. So in that case, typically that payer would always have, pretty strict language written in that contract to regulate any sort of situation where you may want to overbill. So of course that was in there. The situation was the client did not have the contracts organized previously to understand those regulations and updating the, payer, proper notification. So what ended up happening was, they went through a couple of years of just making charge master increases, adjusting the way that they were billing implants, right? Just not really understanding the game, and end up they received a letter from that payer, with wanting a whole lot of money because they were overcharging, essentially getting paid double and triple the amounts. And so just kind of falls back to standard 101 managed care practice. Have your managed care contracts, have them organized where you understand the ins and outs, because that notice is key. What would happen if you did notify that payer correctly? They would properly adjust your contract to account for anything over what was in the contract. So if it said you can only increase 5% annually, you sent them 20%, they would just adjust that contract typically to then align with what your increase was. So, very regulated situations, but we find stories like this every day where ASCs just they don't have the contracts. One, they're not organized. Two, and then they're just making changes and business changes to multiple $1 million centers without having the rules. So very dangerous game. And the other thing too is we still have a situation where a lot of centers are just using a multiple of Medicare, blindly setting charges based off of 3 or 4 or 5 times Medicare, and not understanding device intensive codes. And if you have a code in there that maybe 20 or $30,000 per Medicare, and you multiply that times 5, and you have 3 or 4 codes on that claim, you quickly have a $500,000 claim, and that's sometimes off-putting to the patients, but also maybe a situation when billing those payers, you could end up in a high dollar bill review or some situation like that. So
yeah. I think that's a good example of the complexity that come into play, because it's, on the surface, the charge master is kind of, a basic concept of, your services, procedures, and list price for that. But I think it's the way that charge master interacts with the payers and interacts with the contracts, as you said, that can introduce the complexity. Question for you is, how does the accuracy of that charge master impact overall reimbursements? And I think you gave, one example where, it's not even that it was inaccurate, it's kind of the way that it was managed from a price increase perspective didn't align with the way that the contracts are written. But have you also seen examples where charge masters just become inaccurate over time, and that impacts reimbursements
Oh,
as well?
absolutely. Yeah. So we'll get in there and take over a client, and the first thing we do is we do a charge master analysis to understand, what the current charges are in the system and what the allowed amounts are, right? But if you don't have the contracts, you can't perform that. So really, the first step is maintaining those complete files, and then to your point, applying those rates to make sure that you have an accurate charge master, meaning there's no lost revenue, you're not underbilling any claims. Typically the payer may or may not pay lesser of, but you still do have a lot of contract language out there where the payer wills absolutely, if you bill under, they're going to pay you that lesser amount. So it's an important exercise to do, and we recommend you do it every year due to changes in your contracts, new codes that you may want to add. Just a lot of changes within healthcare happen quickly, so that annual checkup is something that's really important to have.
Got it. So that best practice you recommend is check up on it once a year. What about an ASC that may be building this out from scratch? How do you avoid kind of the under reimbursement scenario that you mentioned?
Yeah, and I'm not, I guess, not discounting the use of Medicare. I think it's a great benchmark, but I think using other tools to make sure that what the area looks like, so what the market is kind of calling for. You don't want to, go in at 25 times Medicare if everybody else is at 7. um, and you can get that data through third-party resources, right? That may have access to regional charge amounts by providers. So there's a lot of activity, as you probably know, out there with price transparency. There's published payer rates provided on the websites of those larger payers. A lot of AI companies offering services to help you understand the region. So I think we're at a point now in the ASC world more than ever where you have the data to make a really good decision on it. It's just, do you want to access it? If you're just one ASC, the cost is really not a whole lot, and you can really get a good idea about where you should be within that market. We had a paper article published in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch here a couple of years ago, and they were analyzing hospital charges for a particular procedure. And they were just, they had one procedure and they took it to 4 different hospitals, and the article was about how different the charges were, right? One was 30,000, one was 200,000, right? And so to the public, when we see gross billed charge, we don't understand that's not what we're getting paid. It's a different story. So that's an important area to manage. And I think moving towards more patient provider transparency, we're going to get more areas where maybe that charge is looked at twice and third time. And
Yeah.
so, yeah.
So that's interesting. So it's not just because I feel like the concern that's obvious about Chargemaster accuracy is, hey, I don't want to have something in there where, I might come up with an underbilling situation like you mentioned earlier. But you can actually have the opposite issue too, where if your Chargemaster has an listing that's too high, you've got, even though it may be adjusted and oftentimes will be adjusted, you've got this perception issue
Yeah.
within the markets based on what that gross value might be.
Yeah, and typically we see people will just that multiple device intensive Medicare is really the most where we see people, kind of overcharging, right? Because it's just so easy to do if you just blanket, 5 times.
Yeah.
And just so, yeah, so I think part of, to your point, part of it's looking at, the undercharges, but also the overcharges. And it's like a kind of a PR regulation issue, right? Where are you
Yeah.
within the market?
Yeah. Is there a best practice for those codes that can get pretty high?
Yeah, just break them down. Look at what your costs are. Use third-party resources. I think when you think of device-intensive codes, as you may know, that essentially is, a Medicare code that includes device portion. So think of it as you're getting the surgery code with the implant included. Like a total knee, for example, how Medicare pays that. You're getting everything combined. So if you take a multiple of that, and then you're adding your implant cost to a commercial payer, that's where you get into situations where you may, have an inflated charge based on what you're really doing, right? And so
Sure.
I just think it's important to understand what your costs are, what your overhead is, and then, maybe using that to kind of set some of those charges the right way. But there's also, and this is maybe getting next level, but we also have situations where there's unlisted codes per Medicare, and we don't have a benchmark to set those codes. So how do we organize that, right?
Yep. Okay. Scott, can you walk me through when the payer receives the claim that's submitted, how they go about their adjustment process?
Yeah, I mean, typically, I'm sure when the payer receives a claim, they're going to look at that charge amount by line, and they typically look at the revenue code, place of service, different variables to make sure they understand how to adjudicate that claim, tax number, multiple facets. But they're going to look at that, and what's in the contract says, typically we'll see something like payer will allow lesser of 80% of bill charge or the allowed amount. So they're going to weigh that right away and understand that by code. And the language is such that it may be blanketed for the claim, maybe by exact code. It changes, right? So the payer is going to look at that charge and then critically understand it to see if it's enough to get paid. And then I think the other part of it, if it's too high, it may be put into a situation where they're looking to see why your claim is $500,000, right? Like what's the deal here? And then they'll put that into an extra review as well too. So I'm not saying every payer is doing that, but they're, I think anytime that you're inflating your costs that much, you could get into situations where you may be looked at a second time,
Sure.
if you will.
So there's some nuances here. I'm sure we'll have listeners that want to go into more detail in certain areas. Uh, for our listeners that want to double click with you on some of these topics, what's a good way to hear more?
Yeah, no, great question. I think we're going to be actually at ASCA in Colorado come April. So if you want to come out and check us out, we'll be there. It should be fun. Looking forward to the Gaylord Hotel out there.
Denver this year, right? Yeah,
Yeah, it hasn't been in. I don't think it hasn't been in Colorado. I can't think of a year it's been in Colorado, and I've been going to every one since the last 17 years. So
wow, that's fantastic. Hopefully, you know everybody by name by now.
right, yeah, that's right.
Scott, one final question. We do this each week with our guests. What's one thing our listeners can do this week to improve their surgery centers?
I think you could go. I think this week you could probably go in and print out your current insurance payer profile list. So this is every insurance that you have loaded into your software system, right? Print that out and go through it and organize it to make sure that you have a good naming convention, meaning you want to make sure that you know that the front desk is always naming the payer the same way. You're productizing the payer, meaning that you're distinguishing between HMO, PPO, Medicare Advantage, because I see a lot of issue with that, right? We have a situation where I pulled one last week, and I may have had 200 different insurance profiles in this system. Half of them weren't active, half of them were double, and the other thing is, if you're not properly understanding the frequency of insurance product type, what if you're sending an offer from a payer and they're offering you different rates for HMO or PPO? How are you understanding that frequency difference, right? So I think what I would do is, print out that insurance list of all of your active insurances and go through and organize it, clean it up. And that's also a recommended annual practice as well, because I think that front desk is really so important to not only operation of the ASC, RCM, but considering managed care contracting, our data is only as good as what's in the system. So, that management at that front end is key to make sure that I can look at your data on the back end properly and understand different things. So, hope that was helpful.
It was. Scott, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate it.
No, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
As always, it has been a busy week in healthcare, so let's jump right in. Dr. Emmanuel Hostin, a prominent orthopedic surgeon and husband of Sunny Hostin, who you may know from The View, is facing serious allegations of insurance fraud as part of one of New York's largest ever RICO cases. So the federal lawsuit filed by insurer American Transit accuses Hostin and nearly 200 other defendants of engaging in fraudulent medical practices. So according to the suit, Hostin allegedly performed unnecessary surgeries and accepted kickbacks disguised as dividends. The damages sought exceed $450 million. The allegations focus on New York's no-fault law, which requires insurers to cover accident-related medical expenses up to $50,000 with higher limits for taxis and rideshare vehicles. The insurer claims Hostin used his position at Empire State Ambulatory Surgery Center to illegally profit through patient referrals. Hostin's attorney, though, has completely dismissed the lawsuit as baseless and an attempt by the struggling insurer to intimidate doctors while dodging payment obligations. And also wanted to share that critics have also questioned the legitimacy of the case, calling it a desperate move. Now, given his wife's stature, people are waiting for a comment from her as well, but of course she has not said anything yet, which is the right thing to do. But anyway, for ASC leaders, this case really underscores the importance of compliance and transparency and referral and billing practices. Whether this case specifically is legitimate or not, there are tons of boundaries and rules when it comes to these types of things. With increased scrutiny on fraud, particularly under state laws like New York's no-fault law, centers must prioritize adhering to regulations to avoid any legal risk. This case also highlights the potential reputational reputational impact of such lawsuits even before they're resolved. So, to avoid something like this, you could always invest in robust auditing systems, ensure clear documentation, and educate staff on ethical practices. Trends towards stricter reinforcement signal that ASCs must be proactive in managing these relationships with insurers and referral sources in order to maintain credibility and trust in the industry. All right, switching gears. A recent health affairs study reveals that while most US hospitals are adopting predictive AI tools, fewer than half are testing them for bias, which is, of course, raising concerns about equity and safety in patient care. So the study surveyed over 2,400 hospitals and found that 65% are using predictive models for tasks such as identifying high risk patients and managing appointment scheduling. However, only 61% tested these tools for accuracy first using their own data, and just 44% evaluated them for bias. So the study highlights these growing concerns of the digital divide between high resource hospitals, which are more likely to develop and test their own models, versus lower resource hospitals that will rely on these off the shelf solutions. This gap could exacerbate already existing health disparities if biases in AI models go unchecked. Hospitals serving rural or socially disadvantaged areas were less likely to adopt predictive tools altogether. So, AI models from EHR vendors are currently dominating the market, with 80% of hospitals relying on these tools, while others use third party or in house solutions. Tools used for inpatient risk prediction were more likely to be tested locally than outpatient or billing focused models, which could also perpetuate bias. So, what does this insight mean for the ASC industry? This study really highlights the importance of scrutinizing AI tools for both bias and accuracy, particularly as adoption of predictive technologies grow. So, ASC should really consider locally evaluating these AI models. It'll just make sure that they're aligned with their specific patient populations and workflows. And I just saw ASCA sent out an email highlighting some of their sessions for their 2025 conference in Denver in May. And one of those sessions is all about AI. So I'm super interested to hear what we're going to hear from ASCA about AI in general. And just hopefully there's a few sessions on it. We could see what everybody else is up to so far as well. All right, in our third story, we're going to stick to that same AI trend and theme, but let's talk about automation specifically around revenue cycle management. So, MedCity News published an article laying out 3 reminders for RCM leaders embracing automation. And considering the story I just previously shared, I think it's a great refresher for everybody. So, here are their 3 pieces of advice. The first is education. Make sure leaders and staff understand the capabilities, differences, and nuances of AI, which will help make sure they make informed decisions and just make them more comfortable in general. The second is strategy. So, this will provide a roadmap that is tailored to your specific organizational goals and will help you stay focused on what you're actually trying to accomplish. There's a lot of shiny new tools, a lot of conversation going on around AI right now. So, if you have your strategy doc, let's say all you want to do is work on reducing claims or minimizing manual workloads, having that laid out will help you stay focused. And lastly, effective change management. So, introducing AI is obviously a huge deal. Making sure you properly communicate with your team will help them kind of embrace automation as a tool and make sure that they understand that AI is just here to enhance their role, not replace. So, really quickly, those 3 tips were education, strategy, and effective change management. And at the end of the day, when rolled out correctly, automation can be low risk and high reward in the RCM world. You could lower costs, increase productivity, reduce errors, especially around those mundane, tricky tasks like prior auths or claim follow ups. And by starting small and scaling up, you'll reinforce a sustainable approach and allow your team members to grow with you and ultimately get buy in from everyone. And if you are using AI at all at your ASC, please head to HST's LinkedIn or YouTube pages to share how. I would love to hear from you. And to end our new segment on a positive note, ER nurse Carly Minyard achieved a remarkable 17-minute door-to-treatment time for stroke care at St. Mary's Regional Health System in Russellville, Arkansas, setting a new hospital record and saving a patient's life. Her decisive action, clinical expertise, and commitment earned her the title of Nurse of the Week by the Daily Nurse. A patient arrived at the ER with slurred speech, facial droop, and one-sided weakness. Thanks to Minyard's swift response and the teamwork of her night shift colleagues, the patient experienced a dramatic recovery, regaining strength and clear speech. She credits her success to effective communication and collaboration, showcasing what nursing excellence is really all about. And as a reminder, you can recognize stroke symptoms using the Be Fast acronym. So it's balance issues, eye changes, face drooping, arm weakness, speech difficulties, and the urgency of time. So excellent work by Carly and the rest of her team at St. Mary's Regional Health System. And that officially wraps up this week's podcast. Thank you, as always, for spending a few minutes of your week with us. Make sure to subscribe or leave a review on whichever platform you're listening from. I hope you have a great day, and we will see you again next week.